3. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from dark, hidden sources, which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying toward the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of Oldzaduk Allen set up new currents in my mind, and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the natives made it unsafe to be seen talking to him. Yet the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the fireman would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness, and fall in with Oldzaduk after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or two at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliot Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the staring Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for, shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of Oldzaduk Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and by going a few squares south I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf, and being free to question Oldzaduk unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy "Hey, mister!" behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked along to Water Street, and turned southward amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length I saw a grass-grown opening toward the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long, secret colloquy, so I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Toward the end of the second hour I feared my quart of whisky would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave Oldzaduk and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was toward the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent toward me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. "That's where it all began. That cursed place of all wickedness, where the deep water starts. Gate of hell. Sheer drop down to a bottom no sounding line can touch. Old Captain Abel done it. Him that found out more'n was good for him in the South Sea Islands. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our menfolks killed at privateering in the War of 8 and 12 all lost with the Elysee brig and the Ranger Snow. Both of 'em Gilman ventures. Obed Marshey had 3 ships afloat. Brigantine Columbi, brig Hetty, and bark Sumatry Queen. He was the only one that's kept on with the East Indian Pacific trade, though Ezra Martin's barkentine Malay Pride made a venture as late as 28. Never was nobody like Captain Obed, old limb of Satan. Can mind him a telling about foreign parts and calling all the folks stupid for going to Christian meeting and bearing their burdens meek and lowly. Says they ought to get better gods like some of the folks in the Injies. Gods as 'ud bring 'em good fishing in return for their sacrifices, and 'ud really answer folks' prayers. Matt Elliot, his first mate, talked a lot too. Only he was agin folks doing any heathen things. Told about an island east of Otaheite where there was a lot of stone ruins older than anybody knew anything about, kind of like them on Ponape in the Carolines, but with carvings of faces that looked like the big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near there, too, where there was other ruins with different carvings. Ruins all worn away, like they'd been under the sea once, and with pictures of awful monsters all over 'em. Well, Sir Matt, he says the natives round there had all the fish they could catch, and sported bracelets and armlets and head rings made out of a queer kind of gold, and covered with pictures of monsters just like the ones carved over the ruins on the little island. Sort of fish-like frogs, or frog-like fishes, that was drawed in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. Nobody could get out of them where they got all the stuff, and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish in plenty even when the very next islands had lean pickings. Matt, he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices besides, that lots of the handsome young folks would drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that they weren't many old folks around. Also, he thinks some of the folks look darn queer even for Kanakas. It took Obed to get the truth out of them even. I don't know how he done it, but he begun by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they come from and if they could get more, and finally wormed a story out of the old chief, Wallachia they called him. Nobody but Obed had ever believed the old yellow devil, but the captain could read folks like they was books. Yeah, nobody never believes me now when I tell 'em, and I don't suppose you will, young feller, though, come to look at ye, you have kind of got them sharp green eyes like Obed had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere pretentiousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Well, so Obed he learnt that they's things on this earth as most folks never heard about, and wouldn't believe if they did hear. It seems these Kanakas was sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of god things that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favour in return. They met the things on the little islet with the queer ruins, and it seems them awful pictures of frogfish monsters were supposed to be pictures of these things. Maybe they was the kind of critters as got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems they was some of the things alive in the stone buildings when the island come up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakas got wind they was down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pieced up a bargain afore long. Them things liked human sacrifices. Had 'em ages afore, but lost track of the upper world after a time. What they done to the victims, it ain't for me to say, and I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was all right with the heathens, 'cause they'd been having a hard time and was desperate about everything. They'd give a certain number of young folks to the sea things, twice every year, May even Halloween, regular as could be. Also give some of the carved knickknacks they made. Things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They drove 'em in from all over the sea, and a few gold-like things now and then. Well, as I says, the natives met things on the little volcanic islet, going there in canoes with the sacrifices, etc., and bringing back any of the gold-like jewels as was coming to 'em. At first, the things didn't never go to the main island, but after time they come to. Seems they hankered after mixing with the folks and having joint ceremonies on the big days, May even Halloween. You see, they was able to live both in and out of water, what they call amphibians, I guess. The Kanakas told 'em as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe 'em out if they got wind of their being there, but they says they don't care much, 'cause they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, any as didn't have certain signs, such as used once by the lost old ones, whoever they was, but not wanting to bother, they'd lay low when anybody visited the island. When it came to mating with them toad-looking fishes, the Kanakas kind of balked. But finally they learned something that's put a new face on the matter. Seems that human folks has got a kind of relation to such water beasts, that everything alive came out of the water once, and only needs a little change to go back again. Them things told the Kanakas that if they mixed bloods, there'd be children as'd look human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, till finally they'd take to the water and join the many lot of things down there. And this is the important part, young fella. Them as turned into fish things and went into the water wouldn't never die. Them things never died, except they was killed violent. Well, sir, by the time Obed knowed them islanders, they was all full of fish blood from them deep water things. When they got old and began to show it, they was kept hid until they felt like taking to the water and quitting the place. Some was more touched than others, and some never did change quite enough to take to the water, but mostly they turned out just the way them things said. Them as was born more like the things changed early, but them as was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trial trips afore that. Folks as had took to the water gently came back a good deal to visit, so a man had often be took to his own 5 times great-grandfather, who'd left the dry land a couple 100 years or so afore. But he got on with the idea of dying, except in canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snake bite, or plague, or sharp galloping ailments, or something afore they could take to the water. But simply looked forward to a kind of change that wasn't a bit horrible after a while. He thought that what they'd got was well worth all they'd had to give up. And I guess Obed kind of come to think the same himself when he chewed over old Wallachaia's story of it. Wallachaia, though, was one of the few as hadn't got none of the fish blood, being of a royal line that intermarried with royal lines on other islands. Wallachia, he showed Obed a lot of rites and incantations as had to do with the sea things, and let him see some of the folks in the village as had changed a lot from human shape. Somehow or other, though, he would never let him see one of the regular things from right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajig made out of lead or something, that he said would bring up the fish things from any place in the water where there might be a nest of 'em. The idea was to drop it down with the right kind of prayers and such. Kaya allowed us the things were scattered all over the world, so's anybody that looked about could find a nest and bring 'em if they was wanted. Matt, he didn't like this business at all and wanted Obed to keep away from the island, but the captain was sharp for gain and found he could get them gold things so cheap it'd pay him to make a speciality of 'em. Things went on that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery in Waite's old run-down fulling mill. He didn't just sell the pieces like they was, for folks would be all the time asking questions. The same, his crews would get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though they was swore to keep quiet, and he let his women folks wear some of the pieces as was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38, when I was 7 years old, Obed he found the island people all wiped out between voyages. Seems the other islanders had got wind of what was going on and had took matters into their own hands. Suppose they must have had, after all. Them old magic signs, as the sea thing says, was the only things they was afeard of. Telling what any of them Kanakies will chance to get a hold of when the sea bottom throws up some island with ruins older than the deluge. Pious cusses they was. They didn't leave nothing standing on either the main island or the little volcanic islet, except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places they was little stones strewed about, like charms, with something on 'em like what you call a swastika nowadays. Probably them was the old ones' signs. Folks all wiped out. No trace of no gold-like things, and none of the nearby Kanakies would breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit there'd ever been any people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the old of Innsmouth, too, because in seafaring days what profited the master of a ship generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around the town took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned, but they was in bad shape because the fishing was petering out and the mills wasn't doing none too well. Then's the time Obed he began a cursing at the folks for being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven as didn't help 'em none. He told 'em he knowed of folks as prayed to gods that give summat you really need, and says if a good bunch of men 'ud stand by him, he could maybe get a hold of certain powers as'd bring plenty of fish and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as served on the Sumatry Queen and seed the island knowed what he meant, and weren't none too anxious to get close to see things like they'd heard tell on. But them as didn't know what 'twas all about got kind of swayed by what Obed had to say, and began to ask him what he could do to set 'em on the way to the face as 'ud bring 'em results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled, and lapsed into a moody and apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder, and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation, but none the less the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in references to strange jewels clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island. Possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself, rather than of this antique toper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whisky, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket. Then, beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself, I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he really was forming words, and I could grasp a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt! Matt, he always was agin it. Tried to line up the folks on his side and had long talks with the preachers. No use. They want the Congregational parson out of town. The Methodist fella quit. Never did see Resolved Babcock, the Baptist parson, again. Wrath the Jehovah. Was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard, and I seen. Dagon and Ashtoreth, Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf and the idols of Canaan and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations, mene, tekel, farsin. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes, I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness, and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, eh? Just tell me, young feller. Captain Obed and 20-odd other folk used to row out to Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, eh? And tell me why Obed was always driving heavy things down into the deep water to the other side of the reef where the bottom shoots down like a cliff lower than you can sound. Tell me what he done with that funny-shaped lead thingamajig as well Achaia gave him, eh, boy? And what did he used to howl on May Eve and again the next Halloween? And why the new church parsons, fellows as used to be sailors, wear them queer robes and cover themselves with them goat-like things Obed brung, eh? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Oldzaduk probably saw me shrink back, for he had begun to cackle evilly. Yea. Beginning to see, eh? Really, I like to have been me in them days when I see things at night out to sea from the cupola top of my house. Oh, I can tell you, little pictures have big ears, and I wasn't missing nothing of what was gossiped about Captain Obed and the folks out to the reef. Up the night I took my pal's ship glass up to the cupola and see the reef a busting thick with shapes that dove off quick soon's the moon riz. Obed and the folks was in the dory, but them shapes dove off the far side into the deep water and never come up. How'd you like to be a little shaver alone in a cupola a-watching shapes as one human shape, sir." The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. "Suppose one night he sees summat heavy heaved off of Obed's story beyond the reef, and then learned next day a young fellow was missing from home. Did anybody ever see Ida Hare or Ivan Gilman again, did they? And Nick Pierce, and Llewellyn Waite, and Adoniram Southwick, and Henry Garrison? Hey, shapes talking sign language with their hands, them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed began to get on his feet again. Folks see his 3 daughters all wearing gold-like things as nobody ever seen of them before, and smoke started coming out of the refinery chimney. Other folks were prospering too. Fish began to swarm into the harbour to kill, and heaven knows what size cargoes we began to ship out to Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the old branch railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody ever see 'em again. And just then our folks organised the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought Masonic Hall off and Cavalry Commandery for it, eh? Matt Elliott was a mason and again the selling, but he dropped out of sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set to having things just like they was on that Kanaki Isle. I don't think he aimed at first to do no mixing, nor raise no young uns to take the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willing to pay heavy, and I guess the others were satisfied for a while. Come in 46, town done some looking and thinking for itself. Too many folks missing, too much wild preaching at meeting of a Sunday, too much talk about that reef. I guess I done a bit by telling Selectman Maury what I'd seen from the couple, though. They was a party one night as followed Obed's crowd out to the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 others was in jail, and everybody wondering just what was afoot and just what charge against 'em could be got to halt. God, if anybody'd looked ahead. A couple of weeks later, when nothing had been thrown into the sea for that long. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silence for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again I strained to catch his whispers. "That awful night, I seen 'em. I was up in the cupola, swim, swim, all over the reef, swimming out the harbour into the Monoxet. God, what happened in the streets at night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he climbed out the kitchen window with his musket to find Selectman Maury and see what he could do. Marks of the dead and the dying, shouts and screams, shouting in Old Square and Town Square and New Church Green. Jail throwed open, proclamation, treason. Called it the plague when folks came in and found half our people missing. Nobody left but them as had joined in with Obed and them things, or else keep quiet. Never heard of my pa no more." The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. "Everything cleaned up in the morning, but they was traces. Obed, he kind of takes charge and says things is gonna be changed. Others'll worship with us at meeting time, and certain houses has got to entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they done with the khakis, and he for one didn't feel bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says they brung us fish and treasure and should have what they hankered after. Nothing was going to be different on the outside, only we was to keep shy of strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We'd all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later they was second and third oaths that some of us took. Them as had helped special had get special rewards, gold and such. Just balking, for they was millions of them down there. They'd rather not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they was give away and forced to, they could do a lot toward just that. We didn't have them old chums to cut 'em off like folks in the South Seas did, and them Kanakees wouldn't never give away their secrets. Yield up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and arborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers as might bear tales outside, that is, without they got prying. All in the band of the faithful, order of Dagon. And the children should never die, but go back to the Mother Hydra and Father Dagon, what we all came from once. Yay, yay, consider for town. Scream and laugh, through there. Gang, the goggle for town. Oldzaduk was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul! To what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus his hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him, brought that fertile, imaginative brain? He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. I've seen since I was 15-year-old. Many, tickle of the folks as was missing and that was killed themselves. Them as told things in Arkham or Ipswich or such places was all crazy, like you're calling me right now. But God, I've seen. They'd have killed me long ago for what I know, only I took the first and second oaths of Dagon off of Obed. So was protected unless the jury of 'em proved I told things knowing and deliberate. I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd rather than take that. It got worse around Civil War time when children born since 46 begun to grow up. Some of 'em, that is. I was afeard. Never did no prying after that awful night, and never seed one of them close to it all me life. That is, never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had any guts or sense, I'd have never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things once about. That, I suppose, was because government draft men was in town after 63. So the war was just as bad again. People begun to fall off, mills and shops shut down, shipping stopped and the harbour choked up, railroad give up. But they never stopped swimming in and out of the river from that cursed reef of sea. And more attic windows got boarded up, and more noises was heard in houses that once supposed to have nobody in. Folks outside have their stories about us. Suppose you've heard a plenty, seeing what questions you ask. Stories about things they've seen now and then, and about that queer jewelry that still comes in from somewheres and ain't quite all melted up. But nothing never gets definite. Nobody'll believe nothing. They call them gold-like things pirate loot. Allow the Innsmouth folks is foreign blood or is distempered or something. Besides, them as lives here shoo off as many strangers as they can, and encourage the rest not to get very curious, especially round night time. Beasts balk at the critters, horses worse than fools, but when they got autos, it's all right. In 46, Canobed took a second wife that nobody in town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to by them as he'd called in. Had 3 children by her. 2 has disappeared yet, but one girl has looked like anybody else and was educated in Europe. Obed finally got her married off with a trick to an Arkham fellas did something. But nobody outside will have nothing to do with English folk now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery, now is Obed's grandson by his first wife, son of Onesiphorus, his eldest son. But his mother was another of them as one never seed outdoors. Right now, Barnabas is about changed. His eyes no more, and his heart shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do sometimes go down for little spells before they go for good. He'd been seen about in public for nigh on 10 year. Don't know how his poor wife can feel. She come from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he caught her 50-odd year ago. But he died in 78, and all the next generation is gone now. The first wife's children dead, and the rest, God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood from maudlin tearfulness to watchful fear. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder or out toward the reef, and despite the wild absurdity of his tale, I could not help beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller, and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with louder speech. Hey, you say something. How do you like to be living in a town like this, with everything a rotten and a dying, and boarded up monsters crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around black cellars and attics everywhere you turn? Hey? Do you like to hear the howling night after night from the churches and order a Dagon Hall and know what's doing part of the howling? How do you like to hear what comes from the awful reef every May Eve and Hallowmas? Think the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell you that ain't the worst. Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I care to own. You see, sat there staring at me with them eyes. I tell Captain Obed Marsh, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I says, can't get me. I ain't done nothing nor told nobody nothing. Oh, you, young fella. Well, even if I hadn't told nobody nothing yet, am I gonna now? Just sit still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody. I says I didn't do no prying after that night. But I found things out just the same. You want to know what the real horror is, eh? Well, it's this. It ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they were going to do. They're bringing up things out of where they come from into the town. Been doing it for years and slackening lately. Them houses north of the river betwixt Water and Main Streets is full of 'em. Them devils and what they brung. And when they get ready, say, when they get ready, ever hear tell of a sugar? Did you hear me? I tell you, I know what them things be. One night. The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek almost made me faint. His eyes, looking past me toward the malodorous sea, were positively starting from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he had glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see, only the incoming tide, with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that fear-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper.
Get out of here! Get out of here! They've seen us! Get out for your life! Don't wait for nothing, they know now! Run for it! Quick! Out of this town!
Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf, and changed the mad ancient's whisper to another inhuman and blood-curdling scream. Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder, and dashed wildly inland toward the street, reeling northward around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there, and when I reached Water Street and looked along it toward the north, there was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen.